the way humanity treats the environment influences how we treat each other. So dialogue with each other is the same attitude required for dialogue and respect and taking care of the integrity of creation. I think the history of the world really shows, certainly the history of colonization and the history of neo-colonization, that the way we treat our environment is the same attitude by which we treat cultural minorities. So when we talk about ecocide, which is, we're talking about environmental destruction, it almost always goes hand in hand with ethnocide, which is disrespect or destroying indigenous cultures, destroying the cultures in this world. So yung sinabi ni yung sinabi po ni Jose Rizal, ang hindi marunong lumingon sa pinanggalingan ay hindi makakarating sa paroroonan. Or as Satayana said, if we do not know our history, we are condemned to repeat it. So this intergenerational justice, it's so much injustice has been done in the past that it is important that we know what this injustice is so that we will not repeat it again. I was just looking at the statistics of the rainforest cover here in the Philippines. When the Americans arrived in the Philippines in 1900, 21 million hectares, meron pa tayong 21 million hectares of rainforest. By the time the Americans left in 1945, that was reduced from 21, it was already 12 million hectares, parang kalahati na. And then by 1988, it was down to 5 million hectares. So it was very clear that the American colonial enterprise was really destructive global capitalism, and that the destruction of the rainforest went hand in hand with the destruction of the indigenous cultures, the sidelining of the Muslim people in Mindanao, and also the oppression of the Muslim people in Mindanao, and then the oppression of the mga indigenous peoples who ended up with no land. And Father Ray already mentioned, and Bishop Tony, about the various land acts, what we call the Jones Act, or the Public Land Act of 1919, implemented by the Americans. It really drove another wedge between Christians and then the mga Muslim at mga Lumad, mga IP. Why? Because it became official government policy to invite Christians to come to Mindanao, and they would be given 24 hectares of land, but the law stipulated that Muslims and indigenous native peoples of Mindanao could only be given 10 hectares of land. So in that way, the land was taken from the rightful owners and given to other people. Parang pawn din yung mga Christian, but that was the reality. When the Americans did the census of the population of the Philippines in 1903, only 10% of the population in Mindanao were Christian. So, syempre, yung sinabi ni Bishop, we all have to live together in peace. But I think it's so important also that we acknowledge the past, what the other reactors have said, that we need to acknowledge the past, because this is the problem, for example, in the US at the moment. It has never been fully acknowledged in the US that their country was built on slavery. And until that is really acknowledged, and until they reach out and apologize to the population who were enslaved and treated as second-class citizens, these riots and these protests for Black Lives Matter, they will never go away until the truth of history is acknowledged and learned from. and apologies are made for the wrongs done in the past. In the 1990s, I was assigned mga 1990s, I was assigned in Sultanaga de Maporo, Lanao del Norte, community 50% Christian, 50% Muslim. Originally, it was ancestral domain of the mga Iranon and Maranao. And actually, the Christians most of the Christians only arrived in the 1960s. And I used to go to say Mass in the barrios up in the mountains, and the Christians there, mostly Bulanon, Siquijodnon, Cebuano, and they would say to me, up in the mountains, they'd say, Father, very proud gid sila, Father, kami ang nanghinlo ni ining bukira. Kami ang nanghinlo dinhi. What they meant were, we were the ones who cleaned this mountain. They would say really proudly, we were the ones who deforested. We were the ones who chopped down all the trees. So unfortunately, a lot of this movement of populations has sidelined other populations and has been responsible for so much environmental destruction. And that the American model of moving people to Mindanao coincided with the destruction of the rainforests in Mindanao. This has happened. Nangyari na siya. Wala tayong magagawa na nangyari. But I think it's good for us to acknowledge this, because unfortunately this policy, this American colonial policy, was continued by the Philippine government. So I think it's important that kung ano ang mga kasalanan ng colonizer, we do not just keep repeating it and keep repeating it. That ethnocide goes hand in hand with ecocide. When we destroy the environment, biodiversity, we also destroy ethnic diversity and people's self-determination and ethnic rights. So ito siguro isang plea din sa BARM, Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao. We must not continue, because kung ano ang naging policy ng US government ay nanatiling policy ng Philippine government when the Americans left. So I think it's very important that the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao does not continue these policies again. And I'm thinking especially of yung mga katatubo na nakatira sa loob ng teritoryo ng Bangsamoro, that the mga Tidoray, mga Menobo, and the Christians living there, they must also be fully embraced as part of the autonomous region, so that this ecocide and this ethnocide does not continue, that we learn from the past and move forward. And also, we should not look to China as our model, because if we talk about ethnocide and ecocide, baka number one sa buong mundo yung China in environmental destruction and the systematic oppression of indigenous minorities and of minority groups. If we just think of the Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps in China at the moment. So I think we have a lot of lessons to learn from history, that how we treat each other is how we treat the environment, and how we treat the environment is how we treat each other. So we really need to live in harmony. We need to learn from the mistakes of the past and to begin to do things differently. And I would like, in a special way, to acknowledge Archbishop Ledesma for pointing out these very important issues, and also to my co-reactors, si Attorney Liza, si Ma'am Samira, si Attorney Alamia. Assalamu alaikum, Sukran.